All right. Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us. In August of 2017, hundreds of white supremacists marched on Charlottesville, and over the next 2 days, using violence and intimidation, they tormented the people there, both physically and emotionally. A woman was killed. In the years that have followed, violent hate crimes have continued to infect our nation. They continue to escalate even during the current pandemic. Roberta Kaplan, along with her legal team, and with the help of Integrity First for America, commenced a federal lawsuit against the hate groups responsible for the violence that took place in Charlottesville almost 3 years ago. My name is Dana Stutman. I'm a matrimonial attorney in New York City. And you may be wondering, why is a matrimonial attorney introducing this program? Well, many months ago, I, like all of you, spent an hour one evening listening to this very panel, albeit live. I went to the event because I had heard Rabbi speak before, and I thought I would like to hear her speak again. And of course, the subject matter was interesting to me. By the end of the program, my mouth was agape. I was dumbfounded. I realized how ignorant I was, how accustomed to existing hatred I had become, and how passive I felt. So I contributed to the cause, yes, financially, but also by helping spread the word. Today, with the help of Rabbi Joshua Stanton of East End Temple and all of the co-sponsors, whose names I will recite shortly, I am here to spread the word. Thank you for joining our program and listening tonight. You will not be disappointed. First, a big thank you to our sponsors, including the 14th Street Y, the Anti-Defamation League of New York and New Jersey, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, Congregation Bet Simchat Torah, Cordova House, East End Temple, the Interfaith Center of New York, Middle Collegiate Church, Park Avenue Christian Church, Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, Judaism that stands for all, and Village Temple. Our speakers include Roberta Kaplan, the founding partner at Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink, a formidable litigator with decades of experience in both commercial and civil rights litigation. Rabbi is perhaps best known for representing Edith Windsor in the landmark case, United States versus Windsor, where the Supreme Court held a key provision of the Defense of Marriage Act as unconstitutional. It was Rabbi who landed that first major victory in the battle for marriage equality. Also with us is Michael Block, counsel at Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink. Michael is an experienced trial attorney who spent over 7 years as a public defender at Bronx Defenders and another 3 years as a litigation associate at Williams & Connolly before joining Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink. He also served as law clerk to the Honorable Chief Judge Helen Ginger Berrigan on the U.S. District Court for Eastern District of Louisiana and to the Honorable Diane P. Wood on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. Amy Spitalnik is the executive director of Integrity First for America, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to holding those accountable who threaten longstanding principles of our democracy, including our country's commitment to civil rights and equal justice. IFA is backing Sins v. Kessler, the federal lawsuit we are speaking about this evening. Amy has over a decade of experience in government, politics, and advocacy, including as communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General and communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City mayor. Rabbi Joshua Stanton of East End Temple and senior fellow at the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership will be moderating this evening. Rabbi Josh was named 2019 Faith Justice Hero by the Interfaith Center of New York. He received fellowships for his work in Jewish-Muslim dialogue and also for dialogue between scientists and religious leaders. You may have seen him on CNN or in other documentaries, and his remaining accolades are too numerous to recite. I turn it over to you, Josh.
Thank you so much. And special thanks to Dana for, in so many ways, bringing this together and bringing us together. At this moment when so many of us are at home and many of us are feeling isolated or scared, this is an incredible opportunity for us to think about an area where we really can make a difference. And I'm joined by three people who I consider to be heroes, not just in justice, but in advocating on behalf of the Jewish community and many other communities that need our support. And we go back to a very different time in 2017, and we try to think about what happened then, and then bring us up to the present so that we can figure out together what needs to happen next. Just one logistical request. If you could put us in presenter view, that would be great, in order to make sure that we were able to have a continuous flow of conversation. We've made it so that only the presenters can be seen on your screen. I want, if possible, Rabbi, if you would be willing to take us back to 2017.
Sure.
To tell us what happened in Charlottesville and how this case came about.
Sure, Rabbi. So it seems like a very long time ago, and it was for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is the current pandemic. But October, I opened my law firm on July 7th, 2017. And we were kind of working out of our homes like today for about a month. And we moved into our office space on August 7th, 2017. So we were just a few lawyers. We were kind of working on card tables. We had a few laptops. And I remember the Monday after Charlottesville, which was the 14th of August, I decided that it would be a good idea. I wanted my new firm to be very committed to public interest work. And I decided that we would watch some of the press reporting about what had happened at Charlottesville to kind of reorient us and to focus on what was going on in the world. In retrospect, that was a bit of a mistake because I didn't realize that the reporting was going to be as upsetting as it was. And one of the paralegals got very upset by watching the news. But putting that aside, we all kind of sat there watching what had happened that weekend in our country. And being lawyers, I think our immediate reaction at the time was, well, we need to do something about this. As everyone will recall, this was the early part of the Trump administration. The Attorney General was then Jeff Sessions. I did not have a lot of hope, turned out to be true, that the Department of Justice would get involved in this, and I thought legal action needed to be taken. So we started thinking right away about what could be done. And I called a friend of mine, the writer who probably many of you know, Dahlia Lithwick, who writes for about the Supreme Court and writes for Slate magazine. The reason I called Dahlia is because Dahlia lived in Charlottesville. And I said, Dahlia, I have this idea. I want to come down and try to bring a case, want to do something about this. And I kind of explained our legal thinking. And I said, what do you think? And she said, I think it's a great idea, Rabbi. And I will introduce you to some people for when you come down here. But just so you know, we are literally right now packing the van in our driveway because we've decided that we can no longer live here. She lived there for 2 decades. We are moving to New York because we don't think we don't want our sons to continue to live here. The anti-Semitism and the fear and the hate has just gotten to be too intense. And Dahlia does now live in Brooklyn. And they left Charlottesville very, very sadly and unwillingly at that point in time. Within 3 days, I think we were on a plane to Charlottesville. We met with a whole bunch of folks down there, including many of the people who are currently our clients and the plaintiffs in this case. And the city is something I will never forget, because the city at the time, which is a small, lovely college town, was really in a state of shock. People were walking through the streets. They were still scared. The memories obviously were still very, very powerful. People still thought some of the people who had perpetrated this horrible rampage were still around, and they were scared that they would, particularly in certain neighborhoods, that they would attack people. And when we met with the plaintiffs, we said to them, look, we think that a lawsuit needs to be brought against the people who actually did this. But many of you have been very injured, and you may have other lawsuits that you want to think about. You may want to think about suing the police department or suing others. And we understand that. And if you do that, that's fine, because many of you may need costs for your medical expenses, et cetera. But if you do that, you can't be in our case. And if you're in our case, you're probably not going to get a lot of money at the end. But we want to establish a principle that people who do this, that it's illegal, it's unlawful, and we want to try to deter it going forward. And every single one of our plaintiffs really bravely signed on to that. Michael could go into great detail about who our 11 or so plaintiffs are, but they include several people who were hit by the car, by James Field's car. And within a few weeks after that, we had a lawsuit filed. We got two lucky breaks. One, there was a group, I don't know who they are, but they're called Unicorn Riot. And they have people who are capable of hacking computers. And they hacked into the computer systems that were run on Discord, which is otherwise a gaming platform, that the organizers of Charlottesville used to plan Charlottesville for many, many weeks. And so many of the messages, not all, we have them all now, but many of the messages that they used to communicate and to plan what they did were published publicly by this group, and we were able to use those messages in drafting our complaint. The second lucky break that we had is, and this is both interesting, historical, and somewhat ironic, I think, is that in order to bring this case, we had to go back to a statute passed by the Reconstructionist Congress in 1871. It's called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. It means what it says. It was a law passed by Congress to prevent individuals and groups, mostly the KKK, in the Deep South from re-enslaving the newly freed slaves. And it says most civil rights statutes apply to the government. This is one of the few that applies to private conduct. And it says that if you as a citizen engage in a conspiracy based on racially motivated violence to try to remove the trappings of being a free person from someone, then you can be liable under this act. So that's a statute we used. It hasn't been used very often in our history. The most recent time, again, not surprisingly, it was used was during the during the Civil Rights Movement. There were several Freedom Rider cases where Freedom Riders were traveling across state lines, were pulled out of their cars and killed. And some of their parents sued under the KKK Act. But we brought this case. We've been litigating it, and Michael can talk a lot about this for 2 years, and we will go to trial for sure in October of this year.
Forgive my ignorance. I'm wondering if you could actually take us back to Charlottesville and tell us what happened there.
Right.
Because given how much has happened in the last month, 2017 feels like a long time ago, and yet is so important for our memories.
So let me kind of tell it in chronological order, because I think what's most important is that it was no accident. It's not like all these people showed up from all over the country in Charlottesville that day, and it just so happened that they all marched in single file, that they ran into a protester, that incredible amounts of violence were committed. That was all planned. So as I said, there's a computer platform called Discord that was used a lot by gamers. And they decided to take that platform and create a Charlottesville channel that would be used to plan Charlottesville. So going back to the spring of 2017, the leaders of this movement decided to organize together. They didn't get along so well before this, and they still don't get along so well, but for purposes of this, they got along. And they organized various channels on Discord that range from topics like transportation, to weaponry, to self-defense, or how to make it look like self-defense is really what it was. And they carefully, meticulously planned what was going to happen. So they all basically, they had resources. We still don't know where they got their resources from, but they all converged on Charlottesville on August 11, 2017. The incidents began with what's known as the Torchlit Rally, which they really did manage to keep secret, where they all descended upon the University of Virginia campus, a place called Nameless Field, just at sunset. And then they marched through the campus with lit tiki torches, wearing white shirts, shouting Nazi slogans, including blood and soil, and Jews will not replace us. And they marched across campus, and then they kind of met up at a Thomas Jefferson statue, which is just on the other side of the rotunda. And there at the statue, there were several students, protesters, who were trying to protest the hatred and the racism and the anti-Semitism that these people espouse. Those protesters, including two of our plaintiffs, were encircled by this angry crowd of haters who intended and did throw torch fuel on them, tried to set them afire. In a lot of ways, it was probably the most terrifying part of the entire weekend. One of our plaintiffs, who's an undergrad, was then an undergrad at UVA, said that he really thought he was going to die. Across the street at that point, there was an interfaith service with Jews and Christians and Muslims all meeting. It's a church called St. Paul's. They were essentially trapped in St. Paul's because they were told that, and there were children there, that if they left, they might get attacked by this horrible group of people. And that was Friday night. That was the opening of the events. And that really got them all motivated and excited to continue to do more violence and to hurt more people on Saturday. And Saturday was in the town of Charlottesville proper, which is a small little town. Lots of fighting, lots of weaponry, lots of attacks, culminating, of course, in a guy by the name of James Fields, who had traveled there from Ohio, wearing the uniform of Vanguard America, a white polo and khaki pants, drove a car into the crowd, killing Heather Heyer and injuring many, many people, including, as I said, several of our plaintiffs. People may, we should have had it, I apologize for this, but people may have in their minds, there was a Pulitzer Prize winning photo of a very large African-American man basically being thrown in the air when the car hit. His name is Marcus Martin. He's one of the plaintiffs in our case. His fiance, Marissa, who he pushed away when he saw the car coming and saved her life, is also one of the plaintiffs in our case.
And I think it's also worth noting that the complaint itself really describes what Rabbi just went through in great detail. It's available on Integrity First for America's website, and I would encourage folks to read it. And for me, there's so much that sticks with me in it, but there's one story about the synagogue, which was surrounded on Saturday morning by these neo-Nazis, where they stood outside a synagogue having Shabbat services, carrying semi-automatic weapons, chanting Sieg Heil, talking online about, quote, torching those Jewish monsters. And they had to evacuate the synagogue, evacuate the Torah scrolls. And one Torah scroll that had been saved from Nazi Germany had to be evacuated again. This scroll that had, again, survived Nazi Germany was yet again under Nazi threat in America in 2017. And for me, every time I read that in the complaint, every time I think about that, that just gets at the core of how horrific this was to me. And I don't think, everyone should be horrified by what Rabbi just described, and none of it should feel normal to us. And for me, that really sort of drives the message home.
What is motivating these sorts of haters? It seems like there was a systematic effort online to bring them together, but what is their underlying motivation? What gets someone to hate others? And also, who do they hate?
So I'm going to let Michael go into the detail, but let me just begin by saying it's pretty hard to surprise me. Given what I do for a living, I have pretty thick skin. And there were very few things in this case that surprised me, other than the fact that it is now, I think, quite clear to us, frankly, it's pretty clear to the people down in Charlottesville, that these guys, mostly men who did this, they hate, let me just be really clear, they hate African Americans, they hate Muslims, they hate immigrants, they hate gay people, they're not so crazy about women. But there is one group, above all, that they hate more than anyone else, and that is the Jews. I was astounded by that. When you read, and I want Michael to go into this, when you read what they say, what they said then and what they say now, 90% of their invective is about the Jews. We can explain why that is. I mean, there's theories for why that is, but what was so shocking to me about that is most of these people came from rural areas all across the country where I have to assume they don't really know any Jews. So the fact that this age-old hatred of anti-Semitism was what drove all these people to Charlottesville to do this, to me, even with all my thick skin and cynicism, was astounding. And Michael, why don't you give some detail about kind of what they say and what they were thinking?
Yeah, I think it's really important to call this what it was, and this is a big part of our lawsuit, which was a carefully planned, racially motivated weekend of terrorism. And so, you know, what motivates these particular white nationalists? They would say ultimately what they want is a white ethno-state. They want a country of purely white people. And in their view, as Rabbi says, they hate lots and lots of different groups that aren't white. But in their view, it's Jewish people that are really motivating what they call, sort of preposterously, they call white genocide. And so in their view, white people are being erased from the earth. They need to fight back. They really wanted Charlottesville to be the weekend where they showed the world that they could, quote, control the streets, that they could control physical space. And they wanted to do that through violence and a particularly kind of fantastic array of violence. So in their sort of worldview, this is all part of a movement that in their view is growing. And Charlottesville was a great opportunity to really show the world how powerful they were.
What is the difference? This is a question from Rebecca Shore, who actually worked with you, Rabbi, and
Yes,
the very best.
one of the best lawyers I ever worked with.
Her daughter actually sends the question. This is Sarah Diaz's question. What is the line between Skokie and the horrific incitement of violence here in Charlottesville? And
It sounds like,
define it.
sure. It sounds like she's going to be almost as good or maybe better a constitutional lawyer than her mother, but let me try to explain, because that's an excellent question. The answer has to do with, so this is all about the First Amendment, and the main defense that you will hear from the other side in this case is that everything they did was protected by the First Amendment and that we can't be bringing this case. So let me kind of show what the line is. In Skokie, Illinois, which people may not know about, younger people may not know about, which was a KKK and Nazi parade in the Illinois suburb of Skokie, very anti-Jewish, back when I was young, defended by the ACLU, by the way. These protesters went, and what they said was odious. What they said was hateful. What they said was disgusting. But they did not show up with guns. They did not show up with weapons, and they did not engage in violence. The difference between what they did and what this case is about is if all the guys who went to Charlottesville had just showed up and just stood there on the street corner peacefully saying Jews should go back into the ovens, or Jews will not replace us, or may you burn, may you and all your descendants burn into eternity, which are the kinds of things that they said, they would have had a First Amendment right to do that. But what they don't have is the right, motivated by these beliefs, to plan and coordinate violence. And that's what they did in Charlottesville. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If there's a gang of bank robbers that get together and they carefully plan a bank robbery, and who's going to drive the getaway car, and what kind of a mask they're going to wear, and what kind of a weapon are they going to have at the bank, they have to do all that using speech. You can't plan anything without speaking, but the fact that they speak about it does not then immunize their conduct from prosecution under the law. And it's the exact same thing here is true. What they were doing was planning a violent conspiracy. The fact that it was motivated by beliefs that would be protected had they just said them does not mean that they're not liable for what they did.
Well, and I think it's so important to also underscore that when Robbie and Mike talk about how they plan this violence, they truly planned it. And Mike can maybe go in greater detail, but again, I would encourage folks to read the complaint where they talked about everything from what to wear, what to bring for lunch, which weapons to carry, and even whether they could hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense. And there is a graphic in the complaint that shows the protester digester that they had talked about. And so when Rabbi and Mike talk about this being a meticulously planned conspiracy, you look at these chats, I don't know how anyone could look at those and not see it. And Mike, I'm sure, has a bunch of additional examples to add.
Well, one thing I wanted to add to what each of you just said is that the defendants that we've sued are very well aware of the line under the First Amendment, and they take advantage of it. And so you will see there are chats online from some of the organizers that say things like, make sure you bring, quote, a free speech tool that can be turned into a, quote, self-defense weapon if things turn ugly. And then they list a bunch of sort of classic First Amendment tools like picket signs, for example. But then they also talk about how to fortify their flag poles and picket signs in such a way that when you whack people with them, they don't break. And so they're very aware of the First Amendment line that they're dealing with here. And to us, it's very clear. You can bring picket signs that say anything you want, but you can't beat people with them. And that's what they did.
I'm going to invite us to pause for 1 second because I hear cheers out my window, and we've got a lot of New Yorkers, and I just want to give them at least a minute to applaud the first responders and everyone who is acting in such a brave capacity. This is a moment of togetherness and of shared values and issues. So why don't we give people 30 or 60 seconds to give a lot of love to those who are working so hard right now. And I'm guessing a lot of people have already gotten up and headed to their doors. So let's just pause for 1 second. Wonderful. Those who need to keep cheering or are inspired to keep cheering, keep at it. We are going to get back to the conversation. So you've defined a lot of these haters, and they actually sound quite sophisticated. It's incredibly troubling to hear just how sophisticated they are at using online tools for recruitment and so many other things. There have been a number of really good questions just to clarify the situation that took place in Charlottesville. Steve Rotter asks, where were the authorities in this, and why didn't they stop it? If there was a criminal conspiracy to engage in violence, where were the police?
So go ahead. You should answer that, Michael. You have the facts closest to you on that one, on that issue.
Well, I would say a couple things. Number one, Discord, the gaming platform that Rabbi talked about, is a private invite-only space, and so which is in large part why they chose it. So a lot of this planning took place by design in secret. And it only came out, as Rabbi said, after the fact when Unicorn Riot hacked Discord that all of this stuff was released. So there was police involvement on the front end before Charlottesville. The police did reach out to certain of our defendants and try to sort of figure out what's going on and how to protect against violence. But in a lot of cases, they were deceived by the defendants who didn't tell them about key moments of the weekend, such as the Torchlight March, including some of the meetings that were planned in Charlottesville to continue planning for the following day. So part of the issue is that the planning happened in secret, that to the extent there was police involvement, they were actively deceived beforehand. And so a lot of this was by design by the defendants to keep the police out of it.
And we're going to want to, in a moment, focus back in on the case, but it just comes to mind the idea that if there was secret planning going on, is this connected to the other terrible attacks that the Jewish community and other communities have faced in the last 3 years? To what extent are they connected?
Yeah, they absolutely are. And I think what we've seen over and over again is just how connected our defendants and this broader movement are to other attacks. So you can really draw almost a line between all of these attacks that have happened in recent years. So for example, of course, Rabbi and Mike have walked us through how Charlottesville came about and the ways in which these groups and individuals came together online to plan and then execute the violence. A year later, Tree of Life happened in Pittsburgh, and we now know that some of the Charlottesville leaders communicated on Gab, which is another right-wing hate site, with Robert Bowers, the Pittsburgh shooter, before he killed 11 at Tree of Life. And then, of course, a few months after that was Christchurch, the horrible mosque shooting in New Zealand, where a white supremacist killed dozens of mosques while they were praying, dozens of Muslims while they were praying in mosques. And he painted onto his gun a symbol known as the hashtag, which was first popularized by Matthew Heimbach, one of our defendants. And then, of course, Christchurch inspired Poway. Just yesterday, we marked the 1-year anniversary of the Poway attack, where a white supremacist opened fire on congregants in Shabbat service in California. And those attacks inspired the El Paso attack this past August, where a white supremacist drove 10 hours out of his way to target a Walmart frequented by a large Latino population. And so you see how each attack is used to inspire the next. We had also talked earlier, Mike spoke to their ideology, to the ways in which that they believe that Jews are responsible for a white genocide. And there's a formal name for that. It's called replacement theory. And we see that theory in play in every single one of these attacks, from Charlottesville, where they quite literally chanted, "Jews will not replace us," to Pittsburgh, to Christchurch, to Poway, to El Paso, and in many other recent incidences of white supremacy, including even during coronavirus. And so, as replacement theory goes, Jews are responsible for the white genocide, as Mike described. Jews are essentially the puppet masters responsible for mass immigration, for uplifting other minority communities, and essentially replacing the white race in ways that white supremacists, deem unacceptable. And that in turn leads them to take violent action to fight back. And we see that theory over and over again. For example, the Pittsburgh synagogue was targeted because they partner with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, that works to support refugees of all backgrounds in America. And that fed directly into the shooter's replacement theory ideology. And so when you look at these connections between these attacks, their shared ideology, the ways in which each inspire the next, the role of our own defendants in in various ways with these other incidents, it also underscores the importance of this case, because it really makes clear that the defendants in this suit are at the center of this much larger movement. And so that by taking them on in this case, we really have the opportunity to bankrupt and dismantle the individuals and groups that are at the center of this violent movement. And it will have ripple effects that go well beyond Charlottesville, with national and potentially global implications.
Going back to your question, Rabbi, I think the answer to the question, where were the police, is that looking back on it now, we understand that there's this widespread racist, white nationalist group of people out there. At the time of Charlottesville, no one really knew. Charlottesville was the beginning of what we now know is reality. And in our country, it's been pretty uncommon to have this kind of anti-Semitic, racialized, organized violence. So to be honest, no one was really expecting it. And honestly, Rabbi, if you had asked me in August or September, October 2017, did I think that all this stuff would have followed it? I probably would have said no way. I mean, only now can we look at it from this vantage point and realize that Charlottesville was really the spark that set so much of this off.
Now, Amy mentioned something that forthrightly has me a bit scared, which is there's some sort of conspiracy or set of conspiracies about on the part of neo-Nazis and other white nationalist groups about Jews and coronavirus. Can you say more about this? Because this is not happy news to me. And I think it probably has not surfaced nearly as much because we've been preoccupied with the pandemic itself.
Yeah. There's so much to say about this, and I'll let Mike and Rabbi jump in as well, because I know that they've been closely following this. And you can't really look at our case without following these issues, because again, there are deep connections there. But just like at any time of crisis, we've really seen extremists try to exploit this moment to spread their hate and their violence. It started early on in January and February with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the same sort of theories we just described, where Jews are responsible for the virus or are withholding a vaccine. Of course, we've seen anti-Asian attacks skyrocket in recent months. And the conspiracies behind those were sort of the early indicators of how extremists were going to try to take advantage of coronavirus. But since then, it's jumped exponentially. And I think you're right, Rabbi Stanton, that some of it is not breaking through because of the other rightfully concerning things happening at the moment. But a couple of weeks ago, there was a report that white supremacists tried to weaponize the virus, turning it into a bioweapon targeted at Jews, other minorities, and law enforcement. A couple of weeks after that, a white supremacist in Missouri was killed in a standoff with the FBI because he planned to blow up a hospital that was treating coronavirus patients. And just the other week, the FBI in Boston announced that a white supremacist had tried to burn down a Jewish assisted living facility in Western Massachusetts. And these are just some of the examples that, these are the attacks that have, been attempted, thankfully, unsuccessfully, or that were caught in advance. But we see over and over again, white supremacists who are now online in ways like all of us are, at a level that, is unrivaled, using the internet to spread their hate, taking advantage of the fact that all of us are sitting online, susceptible populations are sitting online at levels they never have. And then, of course, trying to turn that into action. The last thing I'll say before opening it up to others to jump in is that we also see the connections between these attempted attacks and our case. So, for example, the would-be hospital bomber in Missouri was a member of National Socialist Movement, which is one of the defendants in our case. And NSM has been connected to a number of other recent attacks, attempted attacks, and other incidences of extremism since the start of coronavirus. And so over and over again, we really see how the defendants in this suit are at the center of this movement, and that our hope is by taking them on, we can have ripple effects again that go well beyond Charlottesville.
I mean, Rabbi, I don't have to tell you, in one sense, it's not surprising, right? If you go back to Jewish history, the Black Death was blamed on the Jews. Throughout the history of anti-Semitism, the concept of Jews being a group that fosters diseases that kill other people is a very common trope in kind of classic anti-Semitic thinking. So when this happened, when coronavirus happened, I mean, I'm sure they all jumped with glee on the other side because for them it was proof of their thinking that Jews are responsible, Jews and their supporters are responsible for much, if not most, of the evil that goes on in the world, or what they believe to be the evil that goes on in the world. One thing I think I'd love it if Michael can touch on is that one of the key issues in the case has been our efforts to obtain the emails and the chats and the texts that these guys engaged in. God, I would love to get my hands on their Zoom conversations now. I don't know if we ever will, but I'd like Michael to talk a little bit about what we've done and the motions that we've had to bring about it.
Yeah, so we've been basically mired in a battle over discovery for the last 2 years, trying to get from each of the defendants the electronic communications they used to plan the rally. So in addition to Discord, which we ultimately obtained, we have been fighting to get their cell phones and email accounts and social media accounts, all of which were used extensively to plan this racially motivated conspiracy. And so, as you might imagine, neo-Nazis are not entirely cooperative with federal court orders, to say the least. So as soon as we issued sort of discovery requests, all of a sudden social media platforms were deleted, phones disappeared. We've had a phone supposedly fall in a toilet. We've had a phone supposedly was quote unquote electrocuted. And so over the course of the last 2 years, we have been dealing with evidence that has been disappearing and in all likelihood destroyed. So what we've done over the course of the last year and a half or so is we've gathered the evidence that still exists, and there's plenty of it. But we've also been filing motions to compel as well as motions for sanctions based on discovery misconduct, including destruction of evidence. We've had a number of defendants sanctioned. One was held in civil contempt and actually incarcerated for a short period of time. We have a number of sanctions motions still pending, and we've had a number of sanctions motions granted that has given us access to more evidence, court-ordered depositions, sometimes financial penalties. But so we have been really fighting to get what still exists, as well as get court-ordered remedies for the evidence that has been destroyed. We have largely been almost entirely successful in getting the sanctions that we've asked for thus far, and then we have a number of motions still pending.
I remember hearing about adverse inference due to spoliation, and so that's, if I'm remembering what my lawyer friends say, that's probably what you're talking about, maybe.
Exactly right.
That's exactly right. That's what we're looking for.
Is this keeping you from being able to find the defendants themselves? I mean, have they been able to hide in the shadows because you can't identify them and go after them for various liabilities?
So to some degree, there are co-conspirators that took a very long time for us to kind of unmask in terms of what their actual real world, who they are in the real world. And that has taken a lot of work. Although generally speaking, we've been successful in sort of figuring out who people are online. There was a period of time in the case where a number of the main organizers had disappeared entirely from the litigation, just absolutely stopped responding to us, responding to the court, just decided that they're not going to play anymore. And so we ultimately filed a number of motions for sanctions, and ultimately had a hearing in Charlottesville where the judge threatened, as part of that hearing, to start holding people in contempt. And somewhat miraculously, a few of them kind of came out of the woodworks immediately, reappeared, said, what can I do? I can give you my phones. How can I cooperate? A number of them actually reappeared and said, I'd love to cooperate. I'm not running from this. Unfortunately, my phone has disappeared, but I'm happy to do whatever else I can. Yes, I mean, to some degree, there has been hiding, and there has been sort of hiding behind anonymity on the internet and kind of running from the litigation. I would say, generally speaking, we've been pretty good at bringing people back into the fold and figuring out where people are and who people are.
I should have.
Sorry, go ahead, Rabbi.
Two of the defendants in the case have claimed to the press that they've changed their minds, they've altered their ways, and they no longer are part of this movement. Unfortunately, they haven't shown that in the case because they're still not really cooperating with discovery. But if this is an open call, if they're listening, if they want to cooperate, we're all ears. If they really want to show that they've reformed themselves, and they are no longer part of this movement, and they understand how evil and horrible it is, then they should start giving us discovery. And that would be a really strong step they could take to show the world that they actually mean what they say.
And to the point that Rabbi just made, we've also seen some of the defendants talk about how the case has impacted their ability to operate, which I think is really important to understand. They might not have renounced their ways, supposedly, like these two defendants have, but Richard Spencer, who's one of our other defendants, you might know him as the Polish Nazi who went on tours of college campuses before this all happened, has talked about how the case has made it impossible for him to go about business as usual. League of the South, which is another defendant, a white supremacist group, said they were unable to open a new headquarters because of the lawsuit. And as Michael mentioned earlier, one of our defendants was even thrown in jail and sanctioned thousands of dollars for contempt of court, which I think in a civil case like this is pretty unheard of. And so even before we get to trial, even before our legal team wins these large civil judgments against them, we're already starting to see tangible impacts on their ability to operate. And I think that's a good thing. And it speaks to the importance and the strength of litigation like this, so that when you already start to whittle away at their ability to operate early on, it's important, of course, when we go to trial, and Rabbi and Mike and the team win these large civil judgments against them, there really is the potential to bankrupt and dismantle these groups and these leaders in unprecedented ways, and that will be incredibly powerful.
So I understand just from a little bit of background that this has not only required courage of conviction, but actual courage. Have you received threats as a result of this? And if I might ask to go a little bit into the gory details, what kind of threats, what kind of courage is this requiring of you to move forward with this type of litigation?
Michael, why don't you talk about it? Because I think there's some friends of my parents on this.
I think my mom's on.
On this
I feel like
recording, and I'm not
should-
sure I want them to hear it
They
coming
should-
from my
They
mouth.
should
So go
close
ahead,
their
Michael.
ears. So the short answer is yes. It's we are aware of a fairly regular, I would say, generally speaking, it's chatter. Periodically, it becomes it's often entirely hateful, and somewhat regularly it becomes threatening. So we have become aware of a number of threats to us, to Rabbi, to Amy, to our plaintiffs. One in particular from Mr. Cantwell, who is one of the defendants. He's sort of one of the leaders and more violent of the group. Specifically threatened Rabbi in July of last year on Telegram, which is a site, a platform that kind of caters to white supremacists and white nationalists because of the ability to be kind of anonymous and deceptive online. So Mr. Cantwell threatened Rabbi specifically. I don't know if anybody wants to actually use the language, but it was both violent and anti-Semitic.
And misogynistic.
And misogynistic. Sorry, left that one.
It was all of the things that you could imagine, I think.
Right. It was sort of all wrapped up in one. And so we took action. I mean, we regularly are having to take action to deal with that and to protect ourselves. We do have a robust set of both online and physical security. But then specifically at times like that, we have to do more. So when that happened, we engaged law enforcement. We also filed a motion with the court to try to basically enjoin him from continuing to threaten us. But so the short answer is yes, it is something that is a regular aspect of this case.
Just so though, in case any of my parents' friends are listening, just so they know, 2 days after he threatened me, Chris Cantwell threatened another white nationalist. And he is currently in jail, federal prison in New Hampshire, because he's been indicted by the government for extortion and violent threats against that other guy.
And to put a sort of really fine point on this, while we don't share the details of what our security plans are for obvious reasons, Integrity First for America's role is to financially support this litigation in every way, shape, or form. And the most important piece of that is security for our legal team, for our plaintiffs, for my own team, and for the expert witnesses we'll bring to trial. So I want to be very crystal clear that when someone donates to IFA, if folks are willing, or anything along those lines, it directly funds critical security needs to keep Rabbi, Mike, our legal team, my team, and our plaintiffs safe now and when we go to trial this fall. And there is no doubt in my mind, and I think in any of our minds, that security is necessary, it's critical, and for me, it is the most important role that IFA plays.
So one of the people who is joining us, Jody, asks, how are these lawyers funding the fight against these Nazi-loving terrorists? And I think it is a well-framed question. And Amy, maybe you could tell us more. It sounds like the funding that you are doing goes to security. Does it go to underwriting legal costs? Tell us more about the funding side and how we can help fund justice.
Yeah. So everything IFA raises directly supports the Charlottesville case in some way. The major costs are, as I mentioned, security. Security is by far the largest line item in our budget because that we require online monitoring, require physical security. And certainly when we go to trial, this is going to be a long trial, right? Probably what, 4 to 6 weeks, Mike, or something along those lines.
I think that's about right.
And of course, we will need security at trial for Rabbi, Mike, the team, our plaintiffs, our expert witnesses. IFA is funding that. Every time Rabbi, Mike, and our team win a motion requiring a defendant to hand over their phone, their computer, their social media account, we need to scrape the evidence off of that device or account. And that costs about $500 a pop. So IFA funds evidence collection in that way. When you have hundreds of devices and accounts from 24 defendants, that adds up. And then, of course, there are other financial needs like the, transcripts of depositions and other evidence collection, the logistics of a trial. And so really our major expenses are these third-party costs right now. We're not talking about big legal fees or anything like that. We're talking about evidence collection. We're talking about security. We're talking about these basic needs to ensure that the plaintiffs are protected, our legal team is protected, and that the defendants are fully held accountable and every bit of evidence is scraped off of their accounts and their devices. And again, everything that's donated to Integrity First for America or C3, it's tax deductible, but you can also be assured that it directly supports this litigation and the work that we're talking about here tonight.
Can I ask a naive question? As one who knows very little about the law, why aren't these criminal proceedings? Why has the government not taken up action against violent white supremacists committing criminal conspiracies?
Michael, go ahead. As a former public defender, you should answer this one.
I think that's a fair question. I don't believe it's because, well, let me put it this way. I do believe that there is the legal authority to bring prosecutions. I just don't know that there is the will to have done it. I think and I think you can speculate about why that is. It just seems like this is an environment where that's not a high priority. I think the most kind of clear-cut example of that is there's a statute in Virginia that makes it illegal to carry fire with the purpose of intimidating. And in terms of what happened Friday night, where you had hundreds of neo-Nazis carrying torches through UVA's campus with the express purpose and effect of intimidating people, and probably dozens at least of videos capturing the whole thing, I think it's a clear violation of the statute. There's overwhelming evidence of it, and I think the Charlottesville and UVA community very much were interested in there being prosecutions, at least on the state level. And I know there was pressure put on the local DA's office to do so. And apparently the response was that there's not enough evidence. So, I think you can sort of draw your own conclusions as to why there haven't been prosecutions, but I don't think it's because there isn't the legal authority to do so.
And none of this is happening
across state lines. I mean, isn't some of this theoretically federal prosecution?
This is what the Civil Rights Department of the Department of Justice, actually the entire Department of Justice, was started after the Civil War to deal with racialized violence in the Deep South. And the Civil Rights Division of that department has a long, proud history of bringing civil rights cases in circumstances like this. Again, I don't want to, people can make their own conclusions, but the main effort of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice today has been a lawsuit fighting affirmative action supposedly at Harvard University. They just have not been interested in this. We didn't think that they would be. I should say there have been individualized prosecutions. So James Fields will be in jail for the rest of his life. He pled out to life in prison. Cantwell, who's now in federal prison for making threats, but after Charlottesville was also prosecuted and was kicked out of the state of Virginia for a certain amount of time. So there have been some individual prosecutions, but no one's looking at the conspiracy, the fact that all these people got together and planned this the way that our case is.
And there are numbers that back up what Mike and Rabbi just described. DOJ civil rights investigations are down 2/3 from the beginning of the Obama administration. We've seen anecdote after anecdote of how, for example, the Department of Homeland Security scrapped a domestic terror intelligence unit. Certainly in the last 8 months or so since El Paso, we've seen an uptick in FBI prosecutions of white supremacists. And just the other week, the State Department designated for the first time a white supremacist group as a foreign terror organization, the Russian Imperial Movement, which, shocker, also has ties to one of our defendants, Matthew Heimbach. So we've certainly seen some positive steps, particularly in the last few months in terms of the federal government. But overall, what's needed here is a much more robust effort that started years ago. But instead, this crisis of white supremacy and domestic terrorism was put on the back burner. And in many cases, like with DOJ Civil Rights Division, actively undermined by decreasing investigations and prosecutions. And so when you're grappling with that, it makes private plaintiffs like ours and civil cases like this one all the more critical, because it really is the only game in town trying to hold accountable the broad leadership of this movement.
So can you catch us up on the legal side? And then I want to turn the corner and talk about what we can do. But on the legal side, tell us more about the plaintiffs. Tell us a bit more about how you chose from among the potential defendants. And then let us know where things are right now, because it seems like things are very much in motion as we speak, and you've generously made time during a very busy period in the litigation itself.
So let me start, and then Michael should add in. So the plaintiffs that we have were people who, starting with people I met that very first trip down to Charlottesville, who were all people who were some quite grievously injured by the events, either on Friday night or on Saturday night, or for some of them both. And they're all brave people who are willing to say, I think this principle and holding the people truly responsible, accountable, is the most important thing, and I am willing to be plaintiff in this case, regardless of the fact that I could be threatened and have been, regardless of the time it's taken, and regardless of the fact that, with the exception of one or two of these guys, there's not huge pots of money at the end of the tunnel. With respect to the defendants, we had these Discord chats. So we tried to select people who it was clear from the Discord chats were the leaders. So there were, hundreds and hundreds of people in Charlottesville that day, those 2 days. Hundreds of them committed violence. We didn't try to sue people who were just, in a fist fight on the street or in a fight on the street. We tried to pick, and I think we did pick, the true leaders who were behind organizing the thing going back for many months beforehand.
And I would add, with respect to the defendants, they're not just the leaders of Unite the Right, which they certainly are, but they also lead their respective organizations, which are defendants in the suit as well. So we have both individuals as well as the white supremacist entities that they come from. I would just also mention, with respect to the plaintiffs and their significant level of bravery, they were out there that day to stand up and speak out against hate, which itself was an incredibly courageous thing to do. They were injured in the process, and in some respects, I sort of see what they're doing here now as a continuation of that. They are standing up, they are speaking out in the face of real hate and violence.
Where are things now? Tell us about where the litigation is. Tell us about what comes next.
So we have a busy summer plan. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, well, so we're finishing up discovery, although it's the kind of the most active part, because we're getting ready to take depositions of each of the defendants as well as certain witnesses, which we have now, because of coronavirus, converted to video depositions. So we will take a lot of video depositions over the next 2 or 3 months. And then we're set for trial this October, which we will be preparing for as the summer goes on.
I think you're muted, Rabbi Stanton.
My apologies. Just one more personal question for all three of you, which is, how has your background personally as individuals impacted your work in this case?
Do you want to?
Sure.
Sure. So I mean, for me, it's impossible to separate the personal from the professional here. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And I remember, watching what happened in August 2017. I was with my mom and my sister. We were throwing my sister her bridal shower. And we had up all these photos of my grandmother, and watching what happened and thinking, what would she think if she were still alive? How could, the country that she and my grandfather had come to, that was supposed to be the safer place for them after they survived the horrors of the war, let this happen? And I mentioned earlier the story of the synagogue where they had to evacuate the Torah that had already been saved from Nazi Germany and was once again under Nazi threat in America in 2017. And it's just gutting and heartbreaking to think that the same forms of hate, literally the same slogans and chants and images were seen on American streets in 2017. But I think it lends itself to some optimism in a way, in that we live in a country that's based on the rule of law, that has statutes like the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 and other civil rights laws that are meant to protect us. And that's the real difference. My grandparents did not have laws like that protecting them when they lived in Eastern Europe in the 30s and 40s. We do, and we as American Jews and others have the right to use those laws to protect ourselves, to protect those who are harmed by these extremists, and we are using them. And so that really is the motivating ideology of IFA's work, that we live in a democracy, we live in a country built on the rule of law, and we are going to use those laws to protect those who need it. And so for me, that juxtaposition between what my family went through, the experience they had, and the tools and we have now as Americans is quite compelling and really motivates so much of what we do.
Michael?
So my legal background prior to coming to Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink was as a public defender. I was a public defender in the Bronx for about 7.5 years. And so I've devoted a lot of my legal career to fighting for marginalized communities. And, one of the leading forces that contributes to the marginalization of certain communities is racism. And these guys that we're taking on are really the leading perpetrators of racism in America. So for me, it means a lot for me to be able to take on that particular cause. And it's frankly one of the reasons that I was excited to join Rabbi in this effort about 1.5 years ago when I left the public defender's office.
So for me, it's kind of all of the above. I grew up, I'm a little bit older than the other people on this in this panel, and I grew up going to religious school in the 70s, in which a lot of Jewish education was the Holocaust, maybe a little bit of break for some cookies, and then some more Holocaust, which, regardless of whether or not that made sense at the time, it obviously had a huge impact on me and so many people, I think. And I remember as a kid being in bed at night, thinking to myself, what would I have done? When would I have known to leave? Would I have been able to survive? Would I have had the bravery of the people in Warsaw or Hannah Senish to fight back? Would I have been able to do that? When I had those really childish thoughts, it certainly never occurred to me that we would have to be facing Nazis in the streets of this country that I love and that has treated my grandparents and my family so wonderfully. But now is the time to fight back. We have a country with laws and a constitution and courts and juries. Unlike other Jewish communities in the past, we have those mechanisms that allow us to fight back in ways that our ancestors did not. My Torah portion when I was bat mitzvah in 1976, believe it or not, was Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof.
Shoftim, yes.
And I believe that we should pursue justice, and that's very much what this case is all about.
Fittingly, that's a Torah portion entitled Judges. So it makes sense, given your profession, that it would be so near and dear to your heart. So I want to turn this around a little bit. All three of you have taken a really brave stand. Dana Stutman has gotten involved in remarkable ways in making this entire panel possible and bringing us together. I think a lot of us, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists who are here, because this is a multi-faith gathering, want to know what more we can do. And with the reality that prosecution is not happening, it sounds like this is really the way in which we can make a difference, potentially bankrupting white supremacists and neo-Nazis and keeping them from engaging in further harmful and violent activities. What can we do? What should we do? And let us know. I think you have at least 130 willing ears, and I think there are several people with multiple family members at a computer, so probably closer to 200 willing ears interested in getting involved.
Go ahead, Aim.
Well, this is literally why IFA exists. It's to give folks a mechanism to support this incredible case and this fight against violent extremism right now. Rabbi Stanton is right. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of efforts, especially not a lot of legal efforts to take on the broad leadership of this movement. In fact, IFA's Charlottesville case is the only broad legal effort to take on the broader leadership of the violent white supremacist movement, which is stunning for a number of reasons, but makes it all the more important. So there's a number of things folks can do. Coming to events like this is an important first step. Frankly, the most useful thing you could do right now, we know folks are hurting, times are tough. Anything you can give directly to IFA supports this case. It supports those security measures, the evidence collection that I described. Every dollar directly supports our legal team and our plaintiffs. IntegrityFirstForAmerica.org. You can also do what Dana did. You can come to an event. You could, of course, decide to support the case financially, for which we are incredibly grateful. But then you can take it and really spread the word. Right now, folks are home. They're looking for ways to get involved. If you think that your community, your synagogue, church, mosque, community center, or university, whatever it is, might be interested in hosting an online program about the case, give us a ring. contact@integrityfirstforamerica.org is the best email address. Send us an email, let us know, and we will certainly make it happen. We think it's just too important for folks not to know that this is happening, especially during coronavirus, when we see extremists capitalizing on the pandemic to further spread this hate. And then if you go to our website, you can also find things like our activist toolkit and our clergy toolkit for those clergy members who are watching, where you can have sample social media content, sample information that you can use in sermons, any and all sorts of things depending on who you are and what you might be able to do to spread the word. We are incredibly grateful. So again, IntegrityFirstForAmerica.org, donate, sign up for case updates, get involved through one of the toolkits on our website, and reach out to us if you're interested in holding an event on your own, because spreading the word, letting people know that there is a tangible way they could fight back against violent hate is so important. And I think really helpful in letting people not just wallow in the grief that we all feel from this rise of extremism, but also do something concrete and tangible to fight back.
So I want to, first of all, just thank you and thank all three of you. I will say that prior to Dana reaching out, I had not heard of Integrity First for America, and I feel as though it is in the best kept secret stage. It sounds like you need it no longer to be the best kept secret, but just to be a well-known organization and institution so that we can literally bankrupt Nazis. In Jewish tradition and rabbinic tradition, we end discourse like this on what's called a nechemta, basically a soft landing, something gentle, something uplifting, something hopeful. I'm wondering if the three of you could tell us, in the midst of all of this, and in the midst of encountering genuine hate, what gives you hope right now?
Who wants? I can start. I've been doing events like these, webinars where, I think this group, we're used to being on road shows where we do events in person at synagogues and at churches and at community centers. And frankly, going into this, I wasn't sure what to expect. People rightfully so are distracted. They're scared. Folks have lost their jobs and so much worse right now. And going into this, and when we started this virtual programming, I wasn't sure what to expect in terms of people's interest in getting engaged. But the opposite has really been true. People have been more eager than ever to do something to get involved in the fight against hate, to support the case, to spread the word. And that has been incredibly gratifying, and has left me much more optimistic than I might have been 4 or 6 weeks ago when this all really started. And so thank you really to everyone who's took their time out of their evenings tonight to listen, to learn about this, and to everyone else who's gotten involved in this over the last few months, because you're really fueling us and giving us the energy that we need to keep going here.
Yeah, for me, I very much appreciate this opportunity, Rabbi, and it's this generally has been a great opportunity to just to be engaged in this effort against what I think is a very important cause has been uplifting in some ways. And I would say that, you know, they say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think that has been true so far with this. I think that is one particular important part of this case, is to shed light on and just basically reveal what really happened in Charlottesville. And I think the trial is going to be an important moment for that. But I think already we have seen people, at least purportedly, drop out of the movement. We have made it, I think, more difficult for others to raise money and to spread hate generally. And so I think being a part of this effort has been uplifting. I think it has already been successful. And I think hopefully we will be able to really expose what happened in Charlottesville for what it was. And I think that will be very important.
So what I would say is, if you look back at American history, every decade or so in our history, there comes along a trial that often represents more than just the dispute between the parties in the case. So you can look back at the Scopes Monkey trial that obviously had such a bigger impact on our country and in the history of this country than just a dispute between some teachers and Clarence Darrow. In our generation, the Prop 8 case in California, which was going on the same time as I was representing Edie Windsor, and the trial they had there about marriage equality ended up having an enormous impact in educating people that there was really no good argument for why gay couples shouldn't be treated with the same dignity as everyone else. And I think that this trial is going to have that same impact. We're going to get huge judgments. We're going to bankrupt these guys. We're for sure going to win. But perhaps equally as important, there is going to be a day-by-day 4 or 5 week education for the American public in the fall of this year about what has happened to this country, the kind of hatred that has spread, the ability of technology to help it spread faster and more efficaciously, and to renew our national commitment to stop it, because that's not what this country stands for. And I think this trial will be an important step on that journey.
Thank you. I want to thank the three of you for being such points of light, especially at this time when we really need it. And many of us have been literally inside far more than we would have liked. Thank you for being luminaries who are helping to heal our country and bring the perpetrators of hate to justice in a meaningful way. I want to reiterate thanks for all of the co-sponsors. There's a reason we had at different points about 200 individual computers signed on and probably closer to 250 individual human beings connected to this. And it is because we had so many co-sponsors who went out of their way to ensure that we could learn about this sacred work and this work to create a more just society in the United States. And I especially want to thank Integrity First for America, the three of you, and Dana Stutman, just for doing so much to make this possible. We could not be more grateful. And I say as a rabbi, just blessings on your work. This is holy work, this is important work, and this is work that is going to change the world and change the way that the American Jewish community lives its day-to-day lives. So thank you so much for making our country better and for helping our people so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
We're going to conclude at this point. I'm going to invite everyone who wants to email me if they have questions, comments, and to visit integrityfirstforamerica.org. The website is there, and you'll be receiving an email tomorrow from Integrity First for America so that you can follow up and support this really important work. Thank you so much and have a great evening. Be well.
Thank you.